Hello, and welcome back to Coach Ben's Talk on the Shits in Liban, the first century Palestine context for where we see Jesus' life and birth. This is our historical context. So, in this session, we're going to talk about the religious groups that are around, primarily the Jewish groups that are in first century Palestine. We're going to start off with the Sadducees. As you can see, there's the picture kind of say, oh, there are not too many of them. They have some food on the table, some grapes, some fruit. Everything's fresh. This is had a little bit of wealth. So the Sadducees are going to be some wealthy people, and they're going to be very religious. They're chief priests. So not everyone can be a Sadducees, but they are chief priests. They are centered in Jerusalem. Why are they centered in Jerusalem? Because there's a temple in Jerusalem. They practice and worship a lot, and they are connected to practice and worship. If you're not a Sadducees, you need to be connected to a Sadducees to go into the Jewish temple. So they had a lot of power. And they collaborated with the Romans to stay in power, to keep power, as the Romans collaborated with the Sadducees to maintain power. So the Sadducees would use the Romans to scare people, and then the Romans would use the Sadducees to have them vote certain ways. So it was a very much political connection between the two. We consider these Sadducees the city folk. Why? Temple, city, temple. Makes sense. Essentially, they would disappear when the temple is destroyed. Well, that should also make sense, right? Another important fact is that they did believe in oral tradition. That would make sense, right? If you have to be connected to a temple through a Sadducees, that gives them power. So how do you learn? Oral tradition. The Pharisees, a little bit different. They are the masses. They are the people as a whole. There's more of them than the Sadducees. And where are they? Well, first century Palestine should make sense that they're all spread out throughout the country. These are the country folk. And they believe in tradition. They believe in prayer. They believe in law. What's the law? The actual Torah. That it's important to them. They should live by following rules, not necessarily going to the temple. Now, they will. They have to make a pilgrimage to the temple, but they don't go all the time. This may be considered a middle class, even though there wasn't really a middle class at the time. It was more spread out. It was more rich/poor. But the Pharisees could be considered possibly middle class. We believe that Jesus is from the Pharisees class, that he is a city folk, that he comes from where people had to work to survive. Okay? All right. I went the wrong way. Sorry. Jesus has most of his encounters with this group. And it would make sense. If you're from the country, you connect with the country folk, and you're traveling around the country, that you would talk to the country folk. So we'll talk a lot about that when we get into the Gospels. We're not really going to focus on that. Another group that's around is the Essenes. The Essenes, as you can look at this guy, oh my gosh, he's a little bit out there. He's in the forest. He looks maybe a little more, he's very happy. We believe that John the Baptist is from the Essenes. The Essenes we would be like modern day doomsday people. They live out in the country. They are out on the outskirts. They are on the edge of society. They go with the country? No, they out even farther. We believe that, like the Sadducees, they also disappeared after the destruction of the temple. But these groups, they were outside living off the land. They were drinking milk and honey, eating grasshoppers, took baths all the time. They believed the temple was corrupt, which it probably was because of the connection between the Jewish elite and Rome. But yes, so they were out, always believed in this purification, baptizing things all the time, and just always in the water. So there we go. They're out on the outskirts. A very, very small group of Jewish people were also considered zealots. And you can see these two pictures have a sword. They were more militaristic. Remember the oppression of Jewish people, they've always been taken over. We don't see too many Jewish people actually fighting back and saying, we're going to stand up against our oppressors. Well, one small group said, enough is enough, and the zealots did. They believed that no foreign power had the right to collect taxes from any Jewish people, right? Only Jews can tax other Jews because God gave us the land. And they fought to overthrow the governments that took over them, especially the Romans. They would fight back anytime. But there wasn't as many of those as the Pharisees. And so other groups that were around were tax collectors. They could be of any group, they could be of any religion / race. They were hated by all. They collected taxes for the Romans. They would also take money from the top of that, meaning, if the tax was $10, they'd go charge $12 so they could put $2 in their pocket to get rich, or to make money. So they weren't always liked. Common folk that were not necessarily religious, they were Gentiles, and they weren't necessarily Romans. There were fishermen, tradesmen, farmers, skilled laborers. They were all around. And then, of course, slaves. We talked about slaves in the last video. Women were considered at the bottom. They were considered second-class citizens. Below women were prostitutes, which could be also women, lepers, which were people that were sick with a disease, a skin disease. The sick, the lame, the blind, and possessed were all seen as being at the bottom. They weren't, but ultimately, anyone who was unhealthy in any way or form was considered to be punished by God, and everyone kind of believed that, Romans and Jewish people. But at the bottom of all bottoms were the women, unfortunately. However, it's better to be Roman of any class than not to be. So class structure and society was very much based on your gender and your race.